The last thing Cass McIntyre messaged me prior to leaping to her death was a reminder to take advantage of the annual sale on camping supplies that she had recommended to me once before. She knew me well enough to know that I often have to be told things twice in order for them to stick, and that I have a tendency to let those sorts of opportunities slip through my fingers. I thanked her for the reminder and thought nothing of it. The next day, I awoke and saw that her social media profiles were awash in bewildered, heartbroken eulogies written by her friends and family members. At first, I couldn't bring myself to believe what I was seeing, but the posts were too numerous to deny. They kept springing up as the day went on, a diverse and dizzying profusion of them, like toadstools emerging from rain-saturated soil after a storm. That was how I found out she died. I spent that entire day in my room in a grief-stricken stupor, scrolling through her socials and reading words penned by a throng of strangers who all seemed every bit as blindsided by her death as I was. The predominant feeling for me, apart from the heartbreak, was one of distance and interdiction, and of a frustrating lack of access. I did not feel qualified to eulogize her myself, you understand. But finding out the way I did reduced me in my own mind to the status of a bystander. This was a piece with the relationship that she and I had enjoyed while she was alive. Cass and I never met in person. We struck up an online friendship after crossing paths on a forum for herb and fungi foragers. She was a mycophile, a mushroom enthusiast. I was a ginseng hunter. We were all drawn to our two similar lifestyles for wildly disparate reasons. For Cass, mushroom hunting was at once a low-stakes hobby and a spiritual vocation. She was powerfully attracted to the psychoactive properties of certain mushrooms, the hallucinogens that she harvested from the earth, she told me, strengthened her connection with nature and deepened her understanding of herself. There was a mystical dimension to every foraging expedition that she undertook, but the life of a forager never held that sort of romance for me. Hunting for ginsengs, the closest thing I've had over the last several years to a primary source of income. I used to be able to make a pretty good living at it. Increasingly, though, my work had been shaping up to be little more than a profitless series of a fool's errands. Wild ginseng is highly valued, and as a result, it has been over-harvested. Last week I returned empty-handed, yet again, from my fourth and final ginseng hunt of the season. More than likely, it'll prove to be the last ginseng hunt I ever go on. It's not just the fruitlessness of my recent treks into the forests of Appalachia that had persuaded me to concede defeat, to turn my back on the whole profession. I may not have been successful in my search for ginseng, but I did find something else. Something that I cannot hope to understand, the mere existence of which disturbs me in a deep way. I suspect that Cass, with her dramatically more mystic temperament, might have been better equipped to contend with it. If only she had been in my shoes, that is. I'd give anything to hear what she would have to say about the things that I saw. I had an uncanny and inexplicable experience. Well, encounter might be a better word. It was just last week in the woods. It left me profoundly shaken and unsure about a range of things, both in the wider world and within myself, that I had once believed to be firmly settled. And in spite of the fact that I cannot point to a single moment when I was definitively in danger, I feel very fortunate to have escaped with my life. I pack light when I go hunting. The fewer supplies you take with you, the more food and water you could bring along instead. My preference has always been to stay in the wilderness for as long as possible and to cover as much ground as I can. And that was another area where Cass and I differed. She loved over-preparing for her mushroom hunts and customizing her kit bag and lugging around as much highly specialized equipment as she could physically carry. The only foraging tools I've ever needed, meanwhile, are a brass compass, a pocket flashlight, and a flathead screwdriver. And that was what I had on me when I set out 9 days ago for a remote swath of Kentucky hinterland that I'd never ventured into before. I won't say precisely what part of the state I was in when I had my curious encounter. You may not be as lucky as I was, and I don't want your death on my conscience. Ginseng flourishes, or once flourished, in nutrient-rich soil in the shaded corners of hardwood forests. But that factoid won't help you to narrow the radius of your search all that much, if you're determined to retrace my footsteps, that is. Half of Kentucky is taken up with hardwood forests. I reside for the better part of any given year, somewhere in the other half. There was an air of isolation hanging over the forest when I arrived at its southern perimeter, almost a funeral atmosphere. The sky was grayish and dreary, furrowed by clouds from horizon to horizon. It looked heavier than usual somehow, like a colorless, rumpled quilt. Everything in my field of view was hushed and dim and dampened. For Cass or any other mushroom hunter, the conditions would have been close to ideal. For me, they were agreeable enough. It had rained for 2 days. The rain had only just tapered off in the early hours of the morning, and the ground was still dark and squelching in all directions. Twigs did not snap under my weight as I made my way through the brush, but rather bent and twisted pliably around the soles of my boots, as though the wilderness was keen to be accommodating to its unexpected guest. I had been in the woods for upwards of 3 hours, diligently picking over every shrub and stump that I came upon, before my memories of Cass started to become unmanageable. Snatches of our old conversations streamed steadily into my mind, tricking through fissures in my professionalism. She and I had discoursed freely and meanderingly in the manner of old friends, right from the beginning. We were about the same age, and we shared many of the same concerns about the current state of the world. We talked about our plans for our respective futures, and cultivated a fine crop of inside jokes, and flirted tentatively from time to time, and exchanged the occasional tasteful selfie. She was fit and pretty, with a face that was lightly freckled but otherwise incongruously pale, given how much time she spent outdoors. Her eyes were green and sparkling. She had auburn hair that normally splayed slightly over her shoulders but had a way of frizzing up on her in humid weather. We were both introverts by nature, though she still managed to take an active interest in the well-being of her neighbors in a way that I never could. She had an inevitable talent for finding the transcendent within the mundane. Perhaps she found it, or perhaps she was the one who put it there. Her soul was vastly more receptive than mine to weird wavelengths and cryptic portents, and to whatever else the universe sent her way. I wondered if there isn't an inherent danger to having such an open mind, such an aptitude for the otherworldly, such a propensity for magic. She told me once that her love of mushrooming was rooted in her childhood memories of running wild through the woods that bordered the trailer park where her family lived, forever on the lookout for fairy rings, naturally occurring circles of mushrooms that are said to serve as portals into other planes of existence, sites of supernatural mischief and miracles, zones of enchanted earth upon which mortals must not tread, lest they be spirited away, never to be seen again. Cass had kept her eyes peeled for fairy rings, well into her adulthood. Real fairy rings, perfectly circular, with no gaps in them. But she had never chanced upon one, much to her chagrin. I had promised to send her a picture, if I had ever seen one myself. These are the thoughts that consumed my mind, dulling my instincts by degrees as I went deeper into the woods with my eyes downcast. Ginseng hunting is all about proceeding slowly and paying attention to your surroundings. At the same time, it's anything but a sightseeing tour. You can't allow yourself to get distracted by the pretty scenery. The birds and the foliage and the towering trees are all just sideshows, a smokescreen, a safety measure that the forest has put into place to protect its treasures from you. Ginseng hunters must develop a knack for filtering out all those diversionary tactics so that you can zero in on the telltale signs pointing them toward profit. You have to keep your nose to the ground, sometimes literally. Ginseng has a nasty habit of taking up residence in and among and underneath more colorful and conspicuous plant life. A true ginseng hunter, especially one who, like me, is down on his luck, can never shake the feeling that he is trampling his prize underfoot with each and every step that he takes. The only way to offset this anxiety is to keep your eyes open at all times. Ginseng is a creature of the understory, that portion of the forest that lurks just out of sight, below the layer of vegetation that comprises its upper canopy, sometimes referred to as its overstory. Naturally then, it follows that a good ginseng hunter must transform himself into a creature of the understory as well. He must be prepared to spurn the sunlight and to stick to the shade. Forests are far from the only things that can be divvied up into overstories and understories. Human beings have them too. All people possess some parts that you could see from the outside, and some that you can't. When you befriend someone on the internet, no matter how much they come to confide in you, there's no way to prove to yourself that you're seeing anything but their outermost layer. I mean, how much insight into Cass could I really have attained after all, if her death had become such a shock? What if her overstory was all that she had presented to me? There were countless things that I did not know about her, things that I now have no way of learning. I realized as I steadied myself against the bent trunk of a hickory tree that I did not even know where she had jumped from. I'd packed light that day, just like I always did, but I bore a heavy burden all the same. I was trudging up and down the Kentucky hills with a heap of unanswerable questions piled high atop my back. I tried to console myself while I paused to catch my breath by taking stock of the small handful of mysteries for which I was thankful, the secrets that I did not care to uncover. In particular, I did not want to know whether or not she was high at the time of her death. The idea of a bad trip bringing about her demise was unspeakably painful to me. I was plagued by visions of her falling from some bridge or rooftop after becoming convinced that she'd been granted the power of flight, or that some higher power could catch her, or that she was being pursued by entities who meant her harm. Well, I guess thinking about her being betrayed so terribly by something she had cherished and placed her faith in filled me with an inexpressible sadness. I guess it's better to go on believing that she had just been carried off in the end by some hidden malignity in her life at which she had never hinted in her messages to me. Some terminal disease that she had taken it upon herself to curtail, or some unendurable depression that she had finally tired of fending off. Now, 3 or 4 times as I trekked through the forest, I caught myself doubling back over my own footprints, scrutinizing spots that I had already investigated and written off. It was a similar feeling to realizing you have just reread the same paragraph multiple times without retaining its words or internalizing its meaning. I tried to center myself and found that I could not. My eyes roved restlessly over the sodden landscape, straining to catch sight of the one thing that I needed to turn my fortunes around. It all felt horribly futile to me. That sense of futility had the effect of generating cloudy cataracts of indifference over my eyes. A deep and substantial part of my being had given up on finding ginseng before I had even gotten out of my car. And as far as my own hunt was concerned, I was functionally blind. I resolved at that moment to turn around and go back home. It was as I was turning to leave that my eyes at last landed upon something that arrested their movement. About 100 feet away from me, nestled in a clearing at the base of a treeless hill, I saw a fairy ring. A real one, a perfect one. 12 or 13 uniformly shaped, spotlessly white toadstools, all sticking straight up out of the ground like organic patio umbrellas, arranged in a circle so impeccable that it might as well have been chalked upon the earth by a titanic drawing compass. But something inside of me rejected it at first. It was too good to be true. The mushrooms were so flawlessly formed and organized as to look fake. There ought to have been little garden gnomes in conical red caps tending to them, whistling merrily, puttering about with little pails of water. And it was then that my eyes detected a subtle and furtive stirring in the middle of the fairy ring. I squinted and took a step forward, then hesitated, retreating a few paces. My initial impression of fakeness was curdling side of me into something more sinister, something that I could not yet name. I trained my eyes again upon the fairy ring, and it seemed to me then that I had been wrong about my distance from it. The white circle of mushrooms was further away than I had initially thought. Much further away, and much, much larger. There was a mossy, sloping, asymmetrical mound situated in the center of it, and it was moving, making rapid, fidgety movements from side to side, heaving and convulsing, as with silent laughter that it was just barely able to suppress. And then it lifted its verdant head, quite suddenly, in one abrupt and jerky motion, and it revealed its smiling, dirt-streaked face to me, and it peered at me probingly with its green and glinting eyes. I blinked repeatedly, tilting my head off to one side, paralyzed by my disbelief in my own senses. And then, all at once, as I cocked my head sideways, a blinding shaft of sunlight pierced through the clouds and the forest canopy over my head and lanced directly into my eyes. What ought to have been a fleeting moment of discomfort was instead an intense and penetrating agony that surged over my brain like a searing tide of liquid magma. I clapped both of my hands over my face and stumbled blindly backwards, stricken by a migraine that was the orders of magnitude more severe than any other I've had. My blood pounded in my ears with a sound like two pistons pulverizing my skull from either side. I knelt down in the grass, gasping and groaning, and I tried to summon the will to withdraw my hands from my face and open my eyes. Somewhere in the well of darkness into which I found myself sinking, behind the veil of flesh formed by my eyelids and palms, I saw the face of Cass McIntyre. It morphed and stretched and shrank in my mind's eye, flitting back and forth blurredly, like a half-glimpsed hummingbird, leaving shimmering traceries in its wake, psychedelic smears of color that branched and spiraled and bore in upon me. I opened my eyes after what felt to me like a minute at most. The sun had gone down, plunging the woods into darkness. Nocturnal insects flooded the air with their droning music, and my whole body ached, my head most of all. Worse than the pain in my head, however, was the pit in my stomach. Never in my life had I felt so confused and defenseless. I lost consciousness, that much was clear, But I couldn't have. From my perspective, there was a span of unbroken continuity that stretched from the moment I sighted the fairy ring to the moment I came back to my senses. I was certain that I had not blacked out at any point. I'd closed my eyes in the early afternoon for no more than a minute, only to open them again in the dead of night. I shivered and hugged my own shoulders, then rummaged around me, looking for my supplies. My palms were both wet. I had been crying. I fumbled with my knapsack, eventually fishing out my flashlight, with some difficulty. My compass was missing, but everything else was accounted for. Even before I began prodding at the darkness around me with my flashlight beam, I was aware that some kind of impossible act of translocation had taken place. I was no longer where I had been. My knees were resting not upon soft, yielding soil, but upon hard stone. I thrust the beam of my flashlight further out, away from me, and saw that I had staggered, or perhaps crawled, judging by the wet leaves and pine needles stuck to me in 100 places, to the edge of an outcropping overlooking a deep ravine. A shockwave of vertigo rattled my nervous system as I stared down over the rocky rim, and I instinctively scooted backward. Without my compass, there was little chance of me finding my way out of the woods in the hours that lay between me and sunup, and I was indescribably tired. Too tired, I sensed even at the time, to be as terrified as I should have been. I hastily pitched my tent in the dark on the edge of the cliff and scrambled eagerly into it on all fours, seeking vainly after sleep. The dawn was a long time in coming. I nodded off in fits and starts, my brain beset by lapping tides of delirium, and once or twice during the night, I thought that I heard pattering feet moving clockwise around my campsite, softly and rapidly, as though someone were circling my tent on their tippy toes as quickly as they could. And there were other noises that came from farther off that I'm more hard-pressed to recall. I hazily recollect a long string of owl-like hoots that lapsed sporadically into shrill, startling shrieks that might have come from a red fox trying to attract a mate, or a woman being murdered. Shortly before sunrise, I made out a sort of a tuneless, semi-human humming that sounded tantalizingly familiar to me, like a song that I could not quite place. The woods of Appalachia can play tricks on one's mind. I know that. They can produce all these noises and more. I can account for the majority of them individually, but what I cannot account for is the bone-deep conviction that I felt then and I still feel that all the cries that reached my ears were being produced by one animal. I cannot say what that impression was based on, but all I could tell you is that in my tent, in the dark, it was for me self-evident. Well, more than self-evident, it was screamingly obvious. I broke camp at first light, feeling even warier and foggier than I had been when I had bedded down. I packed everything into my knapsack. I started to get the distinct sense that I was tripping, that I had been hallucinating in ways large and small for hours upon hours. My hands were numb and tingly and seemed to be having trouble following my instructions. I could tell that I was coming down with a fever, and I could feel my heart hammering inside my chest, shaking violently and clatteringly like an old-fashioned alarm clock. My brain buckled as though it were being clenched in a vice, like a white-knuckled fist. It took me 3 tries to roll up my tent correctly and to get it secured. I was so addled and harried, in fact, that several minutes passed before I noticed that there were mushrooms ringing the place where I had pitched my tent. Mushrooms that most assuredly had not been there the night before. Now, I'm no mycophile, but I recognized the subgenus at a glance. Once you've laid eyes on Hydnellum Pecky, colloquially referred to as the Devil's Tooth, you're not likely to mistake it for anything else. It's a viscerally disgusting sight to behold, with oblong caps that look like misshapen wads of enamel dotted with beads of red blood. They were all around me. They had sprouted in the course of a single night, and they were, impossibly, rooted directly into soilless rock. I had accepted at that moment that I had either gone insane or that I was fending off some kind of psychic attack. The former struck me as the likelier of the two explanations, but also, in a way, the more hopeless. I decided then that I was going to proceed as though my eyes were a pair of liars, two enemy agents that had been inserted into my very skull. And I made peace with this inconceivable setback by telling myself that all I had to do was make it back to my car. I promised myself that my insanity would be confined to the length and breadth of the forest, and with that, I shakily raised my water bottle to my lips, drained it in a single pull, and started walking. Hours passed by uneventfully, but it was during those uneventful hours that I was the most sincerely afraid. I stole enough fearful glances over my shoulders, flinching reflexively at the small, hopping movements of toads and squirrels to strain a muscle on the side of my neck. Hell, everywhere I looked, I expected to see emerald eyes gazing back at me, wide and shiny, brimming with mirth and malice. I found my way to a trailhead that I recognized, and from there I was able to orient myself and steer unerringly toward the disused lot where I had parked the previous morning. When I saw, from a distance of perhaps 50 yards, the rear bumper of my truck emerging into view, on the far side of the tree line that marked the edge of the woods, I let out an involuntary and exultant sigh. And then my sigh and the sense of relief that had impelled it died a gurgling death in the back of my throat, like a prematurely hatched animal. I swayed on my feet and moaned in dismay. My deceased friend was striding swiftly toward me through the trees. Her green eyes were aglint, and she was grinning at me. It was the vacant, seamless grin of a madman or an imbecile. I choked back a sob and said her name aloud, croaked it raspingly. Not as a token of recognition, no, quite the opposite, in fact. I believe that I intoned it as a kind of desperate denunciation, a prayer to ward off evil. Uttering it was my way of keeping myself sane in the face of what I was seeing, my way of reacquainting myself with what was real and what was not. I believe that I said it twice. Cass? Cass? The figure was shoeless. Its feet was blunted and spongy and porous, like half-rotted knobs of fungal outgrowth. They could not seem to retain their shape. Every shambling step that the thing took compressed them against the earth, deforming them anew. Its arms were open wide. It meant, I knew at once, to throw them around me. They stuck out rigidly from its shoulders, but its elbows were upwardly angled, and its forearms hung droopingly, like those of a mounted scarecrow. It was babbling to itself as it drew near, bleating like a lamb, gibbering like a lunatic, crowing and trilling and nickering, letting out pained screams followed by peals of hysterical laughter. The objects protruding from the ends of its shirtless sleeves were not hands, but stubby, lumpen, gnarled lengths of ginseng root that terminated in wispy, fibrous fingers, finer than strands of hair. They shivered and rustled together and twitched, and I kept my eyes open as the figure came closer. It had the power to do what it would with me when my eyes were shut. It could close the gap between us in a single blink, or strand me in the heart of the woods, or even delete hours of daylight. I stared forward unblinkingly and stood my ground. Something compelled me to try to return the thing's smile. I'm sure that mine looked every bit as berserk as its did. I lifted one hand to shield my eyes from the sun, and with the other, I plucked my screwdriver from its loop on the tool belt around my waist. The thing was almost upon me. "Cass," I said again, quieter this time and somehow calmer. And then I drove the head of my screwdriver into one of the creature's eyes and buried it up to the handle in the hollow cavity where its brain should have been. Now what happened next I cannot say for certain. I was conscious only of a thudding impact against my torso, accompanied by an impression of something large and black scrambling over me in a confused frenzy before leaping over my head and into the trees and out of sight. Something incomprehensibly fast that bore itself away from me on a number of spidery, multi-jointed limbs. And after that, I was alone. I walked to my car in a daze and sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring out through the windshield, before remembering where I was and driving back into town. It took me another 2 days to feel reasonably sober again, and more or less sane. I'll never know what that thing was, nor will I ever gain the measliest degree of insight into what it wanted from me. I would not even swear to the fact that it intended to do me harm. All I know is that it terrified the shit out of me. My only conclusion is that it tried to show me things that it sensed I wanted to see. Wild ginseng for one, my dead pen pal for another. Whether it did so as a kind gesture or to lure me into a trap is anyone's guess. In any case, I was certainly not taken in by any of its ruses. I do not think that I can consider myself a creature of the understory anymore. I've started looking into other ways of making a living. Putting in job applications like a regular working stiff has dealt a blow to my dignity, though. But far worse than that is feeling that I'm severing the last thread tethering me to Cass. I can't see myself continuing to frequent our old forum if I'm no longer a forager. I lost my screwdriver and my compass. I don't think I care to replace them. And even if I did, the sale that Cass reminded me about the day before she died ended earlier this morning, while my mind was elsewhere. I noticed that I had failed to take advantage of it, and the next thing I knew, the story was flying from my fingertips. It would appear that I found a way to eulogize her after all. This is not the eulogy I wanted to write. I don't know if Cass ever revealed anything but the topmost part of her canopy to me. I don't know if she died with a clear head or in a haze of psychedelics. I don't know if she's waiting for me in the place where you go when you step into a fairy ring. And like anyone, I'm sure she had regions of her understory that she never showed to another living soul, secrets that she took to her grave. I could go mulling over these mysteries, and what I do know is that what I saw of her was beautiful. And maybe next year, if I've successfully reconstituted my courage, I'll jump on that sale and go hunting for ginseng again. I'll have to take care not to let it slip through my fingers, because it seems I'm always running out of time.